Hey, everybody. Good morning. First, I just have to say, wasn't Mark a blessing this morning? And Marty, you blessed us so much. What a beautiful story. So let's just go to lunch. We've been blessed so much already. But no, I'm so honored to be invited here to Friends University and to Apprentice Institute. I speak to a lot of different denominations, and I always think there are two denominations that got the best names. Like, don't you like the name of the, no offense to Presbyterians, but but what about Disciples of Christ? They got a cool name. But my favorite, we got some disciples here, but I just think the Friends have the best name of all. That's the best name for a denomination. So I'm so honored to be invited here and to the Apprentice Institute. I have great respect for the good work that you all do. And I'm especially impressed, Jim, that you all decided that narrative was really an important subject to talk about, because narrative has a kind of, it's an important word in the worlds of philosophy and theology, but it has profound implications in the world of spiritual formation as well, and that's what I'd like to talk about. If we can, you can give me some of my slides here. Because stories form people, for better or worse. They can transform people if they help them in a positive direction. Stories can deform people too. There's a lot of ugly things happening in the world today, and if you look around, there are stories that are driving the people doing the ugly things. Stories transform, stories deform, stories frame the way we see everything, including God. You might say that stories precede theology. And our views and understandings of God have to do with stories sometimes that we're unconscious of throughout our entire lives. Any of you who've been through a lot of therapy know that therapy often involves observing the story of your life, finding new ways to tell the story of your family. Many of us are trapped. Our whole lives are framed either in a big and gracious and spacious frame or a small and constricted and confining frame by the stories through which we see our lives. And that way, stories destroy lives and stories save lives. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but when Jesus came, he didn't proclaim the good information or the good system. He proclaimed the good news, and news is a collection of relevant stories. So Jesus came proclaiming a saving story. I live in Florida, and I saw someone with a t-shirt once walking down my street, and it wasn't this, I didn't ask the woman if I could take a picture of her midsection. It was actually on a man, but I was so struck by the t-shirt that I went online, and the only picture was of a woman. Two things every American should know how to use, neither of which are taught in schools. Now look, whatever your opinion is on gun violence and gun control and all the rest, I'm not talking about that. When I saw the picture from a distance, it hit me almost with prophetic insight, because I thought, for a lot of people, those two have a lot in common. They're weapons. And the stories of the Bible are often used as weapons. And I'm thinking about what Juanita said yesterday. White folk especially need to talk about this, because our history, in ways that very few of us are very conscious of, our history is the story about how the stories of the Bible have been used in extremely destructive ways. The story of the Jews, or the children of Israel, leaving Egypt and going into Canaan became the primary narrative, a primary narrative that framed the founders of this country and their encounter with the native peoples. The result was destructive. And if you speak to many native peoples today, they will tell you we are not anywhere close to dealing with the aftermath of that story. The same thing happened in Africa. King Leopold lived by that story, was part of a whole European empire that lived by that story and justified a Holocaust that very few people know about, how in a period of something like 20 years, 6 million Congolese people were killed. The estimates are between 10 and 20 million Nigerians were killed. The impact of colonialism that was fueled by an understanding of the Bible is far-reaching. I know I look pretty old. I'm 57. I know I don't look a day over 67, but I'm not that old, okay? And when I was a boy in Sunday school, white church, I remember my Sunday school teacher teaching us from Genesis chapter 9, the curse, then they called it the curse of Ham. Now it's called the curse of Canaan. It was not a curse on pork products. It was a curse on one of Noah's sons. And we were taught, because of that verse, that I remember my Sunday school teacher very sincerely telling us, it's a sin to date a person of another race, because to marry them would be a terrible sin. Well, the impact of an interpretation of a story of Noah getting drunk and his son has resulted in and has been used to justify unjustifiable things. And if white folk want to just say, oh yeah, that's all in the past, that's just a sign of how blind we are to white privilege and the aftermath of racism and how our Bible has been used as a weapon. If you ever get to South Africa, you'll discover that the whole system of apartheid was designed in the 1950s and 1960s in a seminary in South Africa, in Stellenbosch. And it was theologically justified from beginning to end. It became a political system after it was presented as a theological system. And one of the reasons that Dr. King has been so important in American history, and I think will be for centuries to come, is that he used the same Bible that had been used to justify racism and oppression and segregation. He used the same Bible to tell stories that led to reconciliation and peace and a new dream. Amen? This is important. This issue of stories is important because of what it does inside of us. And then when stories form us and frame our encounter of the world, we create very different worlds. It's going on today. You ever spend any time in Israel? Please, if you go to Israel, please don't go on a religious tour where you see the holy sites of the Holy Land without seeing the unholy sites in a land filled with a lot of unholy stuff going on. Understand that stories from the Bible are being used today in frightening ways. For example, the story of Samuel and Saul in 1 Samuel 15, where Samuel was commanded to go and attack Amalek, utterly destroy all they have, do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel, and even donkeys. And of course, I grew up hearing these Bible stories, never knowing that this text was used by Catholics in the 30 Years' War to justify killing Protestants, and by Protestants in the 30 Years' War to justify killing Catholics across Europe. How Puritans used this verse to justify slaughtering Native Americans, and how it's still being used today. Wasn't too long ago, I think it was in 2009, that Benjamin Netanyahu was asked about Iran, and his response was, think Amalek. Does that send a chill up your spine? Stories frame us. There's been a lot of controversy about an evangelical organization that my children benefited from. Some of you might be involved with it. Child Evangelism Fellowship uses that story of Saul and Samuel and killing the Amalekites to tell children how they ought to obey God. And when some atheists got a hold of that and heard, they said, boy, these people are being formed to kill us. And they got a little nervous. And I can see why. So stories have a powerful, powerful effect. And I think we have some serious work to do in this regard, brothers and sisters. You know, some theological problems are modular. You can take out your eschatology unit and plug in a new one. You can take out your theory of atonement unit and plug in a new one. But some of our theological and spiritual problems are systemic. And you can't just change a unit. Something deeper has to happen. And I think that that is part of our struggle. It's an especially important struggle for white Christians of European descent who've inherited a history that we didn't make happen, but we inherited it, and in some ways we now run the machinery of. We have some work to do on how we look at the biblical text and understand story. And I especially think this is important in regards to the big story that a lot of us assume is the biblical story. Now, it was mentioned before, I was an English major, and I taught college English. And one of the things we used to learn how to do is draw plot diagrams. And one day I was sitting in a coffee shop with a friend, and I tried to draw the plot diagram of the Bible that I had been taught. And I'm going to guess that a whole lot of you, when you see this, you can fill in the names, right? You know, this is the story of the perfect Garden of Eden, the fall into fallen history, and eventually there'll be salvation to heaven, and if it doesn't go so well, to hell. And I'll just tell you, maybe you weren't raised with this, but I was raised, this was the biblical story. Can I tell you, it's interesting, you'll never find the word the fall in the Bible. This story is never told in the Bible, but a lot of us, we've never questioned this. And I know just for me to put this up is probably disturbing to some people because this is our only understanding of the Bible. And I wouldn't even deal with this if I didn't think that those atrocities that have happened in the past have something to do with this story. This story framed and formed us and empowered us to do some pretty scary things. And the terrible thing is, even worse things could happen in the future if we don't have some serious reconsideration of our story. I became suspicious that this wasn't actually the story of the Bible, but this was actually the story of Plato's cave. That maybe in the early centuries of the Christian faith, when our early church fathers did necessary engagement with Greek philosophy, in some way we experienced syncretism. People, I'm sure many of you know, I have a lot of very loyal critics, and some of them accuse me of syncretism, and I'm very sensitive to that accusation. My problem is, I think the syncretism already happened, and I think we have to come face to face with it and grapple with it. Some people are worried about sliding down a slippery slope. My concern is we're way down the slope already. And then my suspicion was that not only had we maybe bought into a story of Greek philosophy, we'd also bought into a story of Roman politics, because the Roman Empire found that the Greek philosophical story was extremely powerful in dominating other people. Now, to question that, what I often call a six-line narrative, the big story, is very scary for a lot of people. Listen, I was a good student growing up. I paid attention in Sunday school class. I read a lot of Christian books. I went to conferences and seminars. I learned how to take every story in the Bible, every single one. Some of them it wasn't very easy, but I figured out how to do it. I figured out how to take every story in the Bible, and like a little piece of candy, I thought I had one, but maybe I ate it. But how to take every story, almost like a piece of candy, and take off the wrapper. And the story was a wrapper. What you needed was, the candy was a point, or a concept, or an abstraction. And we learned how to extract from every story an abstraction that would fit into that six-line narrative. So I was deeply convinced that six-line narrative was the biblical story. But there are serious questions about how that story frames, especially God. Now, I know many of us are deeply indebted to Dallas Willard for the profound effect he had on us, and Dallas had a big effect on me. And one of the things Dallas used to say, I think he was quoting someone else, but he said it quite often, was that if your vision of God is flawed, the more devoted you are, the worse off you will be. And so if we spiritually form people more and more deeply in a deeply flawed vision of God, we think we're helping them, but soon we end up with people like, the Fred Phelps gang up the road, who are deeply devoted to a vision of God. And so it raises the question, is there some alternative way of understanding the big picture of the biblical narrative? And somebody really has done a beautiful job of explaining this. If you want to hear it in her own words, you can go onto the TED Talks and hear Chimamanda Adichie, West African, who talks about the danger of a single story. Here's what she says. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power of the power structures of the world, and it is Nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of Nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Murad Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. Are you with her on this? And so this got me thinking about how this has worked in the Bible, how the Bible, in a sense, we found ways to extract from the Bible stories that help us to dispossess people and to do harm to others, and actually, in the end, harm to ourselves as well. And what I started to realize is that all of us, whenever we say the word Jesus, we don't know this, we're not conscious of it, but when we say the word Jesus, when we think Jesus, we've heard Jesus through a line of sight. You know, today it might be Rick Warren, back to Billy Graham, back to Charles Finney, back to Martin Luther, there's a line of sight. And in Western Christianity, whether you're Pentecostal or Catholic or Baptist or Quaker, there's a line of sight, and it almost always makes its way back to Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Paul. Even when we say Paul, we don't realize it. We don't actually know Paul. We know Augustine's version. We know Aquinas' version of Augustine. We know Luther's version. We know Calvin's version of Luther's version of Aquinas' version of Augustine's version of Paul. Do you understand what I'm saying? And through all of that, we look back and see Jesus. And there's a degree to which I think that's unavoidable. I don't think anyone can get a pristine version of anything, but it's better to be aware that you have a line of sight than to not be aware. And when I started grappling with this, I started thinking, well, maybe instead of trying to understand Jesus and the gospel through the sight line of his descendants, what if we tried to understand Jesus through the sight line of his ancestors? What if instead of trying to understand Jesus through the stories of the Roman Empire and the conversion of Constantine and the Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation, all of which are important, we should know all those. But what if we said, well, along with those, we ought to situate Jesus in the stories of his ancestors, the story into which he came. The stories of Adam and Eve and Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Moses and David and Isaiah and Elizabeth and John the Baptist and Mary. What if we situated Jesus in the stories of his ancestors? And if we do that, we have to start with the story of Exodus. Listen, it's hard to get 10 Presbyterians to agree on something. It's really hard to get 10 rabbis to agree on something. But if you get 10 rabbis together and say, what is the primary narrative of the Hebrew people, they will tell you it's the story of Exodus. And I don't think many of us understand what a radical thing that is. That story of Exodus is a unique story. It is a world-changing, history-changing story. In fact, it affects so many things for us as Christians. Because in the ancient world, every nation had its gods. And in every nation, the gods defended the status quo. And the status quo was that there were an elite on the top who controlled almost all of the money and power and wealth. And there were masses at the bottom who did the bidding and fit in with the plans of the people at the top. I mean, our term for it today is 1% and 99%, and it's been the case through history. And everybody agreed that God was on the side of the 1%. And that your job was to fit in with God by doing the bidding of the 1%. Everybody agreed that. It didn't matter what the religion was. It didn't matter what the God was. On that, everybody agreed. And the Jews come along, and they dare to say that when God looks down from heaven, he hears the cries of the 30% at the bottom, who are the most bitterly oppressed and dispossessed of all. God hears their cries and cares about them, and God is concerned about, about liberation for the people at the bottom. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. Now, again, we tend to reinterpret the story of Exodus through our 6-line narrative, and we miss how radical and dynamic a story it is. That the living God is on the side of the people who are suffering and is willing to upset the status quo on their behalf. A whole lot of Christians, if you gave them a choice, they really would rather not believe that story. I don't know if you ever thought of the book of Exodus this way, but in some ways, the first half of the story is getting the slaves out of Egypt, and that's done through 10 plagues. And then the second part of the story is getting Egypt out of the slaves, and that's done through 10 commands. And that's the way ancient stories often work, with little parallels like that. And it's a struggle we're still working with today. Have you noticed we have a whole lot of people who are concerned about social justice, getting slaves out of Egypt, and other people who are concerned about spiritual formation, getting Egypt out of the slaves. But in the book of Exodus, it's all part of one story. Maybe the reason we have so much trouble keeping that together is because we're not living by the story of Exodus. Now, you have to say, well, hold it. How did the people get into slavery to begin with? And that's where the story of Genesis comes in, because it's the story that takes us from the creation of the universe to the descendants of Abraham being in Egypt. It's a prequel. It's episode 1 to Star Wars. And so... And what an amazing story that is. That the universe in its diversity and beauty and wonder and harmony is the creation of God. And by the way, this is a big challenge for the Christian faith because our understanding of the universe is so different now than it was 100 or 300 or 500 years ago. And so it's almost as if our work of spiritual formation is continually enriched every time the Hubble Space Telescope sends back more pictures, and every time an archaeologist digs up new fossils, because we're learning about the way God works and the way God has developed creation in fresh and new ways, and it gives us new wonders to marvel at and new reasons to worship the living God. A lot more I could say about that, because it's not just the story. We read it as a story of creation and fall. I think we'd be better to read Genesis as the story of creation and reconciliation, because at the beginning of the story, you have fratricide. One brother kills another brother. At the end of the story, you have a group of 11 brothers who want to kill one brother, and they decide at the last minute not to kill him, but to enslave him. Do you see how that sets us up for Exodus? But in the end, the brother they wanted to kill and sold into slavery saves their lives and reconciles. He doesn't get revenge. He chooses reconciliation. Wow, that's a story that can frame the way you see the world. But even with those two great stories, I don't think we've really gotten the full texture of the story into which Jesus came until we pay attention to the story of Isaiah. Because once the people are in the promised land, out of slavery in the promised land, they find out it's not so great to be in a promised land of milk and honey if everybody around you keeps coming in to steal some of your milk and rip off some of your honey. Then you realize that being a one land of milk and honey when everybody around you is starving either means you got to put up a big wall and fight everybody all the time, or maybe conquer them and enslave them, which isn't such a great idea for people who believe that God is on the side of slaves. Or else you have to start a dream of a time when everybody will have his own vine and fig tree, and no one will have to be afraid. And that's the dream that emerges among the prophets. I refer to Isaiah most often because Isaiah is the prophet who gets quoted the most in the New Testament about this. So what I came to believe, and I just can't tell you how much this has enriched my reading of the Bible, and I in some ways opened up my own spiritual life, is I came to believe that the Bible is not a single totalizing meta-narrative, who, for those of you who know terms like that, and those of you who don't worry, you're doing fine without it. But it's not an us-them story that legitimizes the domination and dispossession and scapegoating of people. But rather, it's a multi-narrative that creates a story space rather than a storyline. And that creates room for all kinds of stories to emerge and interact. Now, I'm suggesting this playfully, but if you were to think about the story of Exodus or liberation, the story of Genesis or creation, the story of Isaiah or reconciliation, as not a storyline, but rather like a three-dimensional story space. We live in an expanding universe, a universe of more and more space. That God creates a universe where there's room for all kinds of stories. It's not an anything goes universe. It's a universe where there's real evil. Because if God is trying to create and people are trying to destroy, that's not good. And if God is trying to liberate and others are trying to oppress, that's not good. And if God is leading us to reconciliation and others are leading us to hostility, that's not good. So this is a world of good and evil, but it's a space rather than a line. And then we understand in that space, Jesus comes proclaiming good news of a new creation, good news of reconciliation, good news of setting people free by the truth. And my goodness sakes, there's a story that can form you inwardly and frame your encounter with the world. But I just want to open up then, when you stop interpreting the whole Bible in light of that one two-dimensional flat narrative, linear narrative, and you let the Bible work in this larger space, it really becomes interesting. And I'm just going to sort of just race through a couple of possible ways that ways that have been interesting to me in reading the Bible, the biblical story in this other space. Early in the book of Genesis, we find Jacob and Esau, the story of Jacob and Esau. And if we had time, we could really do an in-depth Bible study on this because it's a strange story. There are twins that are born, and God loves Jacob and hates Esau. Meanwhile, the parents have their own favorites. And the mother sides with God in liking Jacob, and the father likes Esau and sort of loses out. It's a strange story. And if we had time, we could explore the birth and how Jacob was born grabbing the heel, which gives him the name of supplanter. He's a competitor. He wants to get ahead of the brother who's ahead of him. We could talk about what it means in the ancient world for Esau to be an avid outdoorsman and Jacob to be an avid indoorsman. Because for a serious reader of stories, now we're taught to read stories badly theologically, but for people who really get stories, you can't read Jacob and Esau without thinking about Cain and Abel. And Cain is the man who works outdoors with animals. Abel is the man who works outdoors with animals. Cain is sort of the farm man. And in those days, he was more civilized. And after Cain kills Abel, he goes and builds a city. So all kinds of things are going on in those stories to talk about struggles of different ways of living. But we don't have time to go into that. But you think of that story that sets up God loves Jacob and God hates Esau. And brothers and sisters, that story has been used to let a lot of people through history off the hook and think, I'm like Jacob, God loves me. They're like Esau, God hates them. We can take their lands, we can steal their labor, we can oppress them, we can marginalize them, and so on. What people don't realize, though, is that in a story space, the stories start to interact. And if we go later in Jacob's life, it's very interesting what happens. You remember the story of Jacob after he's gone away and lived with Laban and gotten, by the way, Rachel and Leah are two sisters who are sort of, one is favored, one is disfavored. And this time, God doesn't let Jacob get away with Rachel without also taking Leah. So it's interesting things going on there. But then Jacob is going to go back to his hometown. He's had to leave because Esau wanted to kill him. And he's got his wife, and he's got lots of camels and children and all the rest. He's heading back home, and he's going to have to meet his brother. And you can imagine what a scary moment that is. And remember, we often preach about what happens the night before that encounter when Jacob has an encounter with God. But I can't help but think that encounter with God is closely related to the encounter with his brother that comes next. And we almost never preach what happens next in relation to that story. Listen to how it goes. By the way, Jacob takes all of his oxen and herds and everything else and sends them out ahead and tells servants to tell Esau, this is a gift for you, this is a gift for you. The guy who'd been ripping Esau off now is giving him huge amounts of gifts because now he wants peace. He's changed a little bit. He doesn't want domination. And so Jacob sees Esau coming, 400 men with him. He's scared, I'm going to get killed. Look at verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And then Esau says, why have you sent all this stuff to me? Jacob says, to find favor in your eyes. Esau says, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have. I just need to ask you, does that those words, Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, does that ring any bells for you guys? Do you start to see how stories are interacting? So this emotional moment of them meeting, and Esau, who had every right to get revenge on his brother, has mercy and compassion and welcomes him. Jacob says, no, please. If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly, to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Now, brothers and sisters, I grew up in Sunday school, heard that story a million times, never paid any attention to that line. But now I start to think there's something fascinating going on in the interplay of these two stories. One story told us that God hated Esau and loved Jacob. This story tells us that when God shows up in the face of Esau. Something's going on there, brothers and sisters, and you start noticing that. You start to see that God shows up in stories in fascinating ways, often in the other brother, often in the bad guy. Another, we could go a little farther in the biblical story, and I don't have time to go into this at all, but if you read the end of the book of Judges, if you haven't read it lately, it's not a favorite text. Few people extract their life verse from the last few chapters of Judges. This horrific story about a Levite who has a concubine. That's not a big problem back in the ancient world. Talk about that for family values. But anyway, he has a concubine. She gets raped. So, in outrage, he cuts up her body into pieces, sends it out. The people are outraged. They go and they kill a whole bunch of Benjamites. Anyhow, it's a long story. There's a lot of trouble. And now the perpetrators of the crime are left without enough women. And I won't go into it. It's a crazy, wild story. You really should read it. It would be like a great HBO miniseries. And you get to the end, and you realize in this ancient world, so they go kidnap a bunch of women to make wives for the perpetrators of the rape. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, women, you ought to read that to see. And it ought to make you really, really mad. And men, if it doesn't make you mad, listen to the women. They'll tell you why it ought to make you mad. And you know what? God seems an accessory to the crime. This is the kind of people that are called God's people. Fast forward a little bit to the story of Ezra and when they've taken foreign wives. And Ezra just says, we can't have any foreign wives around here, divorce them all. And again, God is relatively silent in all this, but he seems to be an accessory to the crime. You have all these stories in the biblical text where women are treated like dirt. And there's no good way to make it look better. But then, in between those stories, we have this little book, the book of Ruth. It's like an island of sanity in a world of American politics. It's like an outbreak of sanity. Why? Because all the men die. And there you have Ruth and Naomi. And you have a good man named Boaz. And guess what Boaz does? He marries a foreign wife. And guess what she does? She is better to Naomi than any of her sons could have been. And she becomes, their union produces King David. Now look, I don't care about, there are all kinds of arguments about historicity and all the rest. I just want to tell you, these are amazing stories. And if you try to interpret them on a flat line, it doesn't work very well. But if you let these stories interact with each other, what you have is a rip-roaring argument of two different views of a good life and two different views of God. And it's sort of interesting how important Ruth becomes in giving birth to David for we Christians who believe in the Son of David being our Savior. It's amazing. We could do another one. In fact, one of my favorites is the story of, not favorites, is Joshua and the Canaanites. But I don't know if you've ever really read Deuteronomy chapter 7, where Joshua was told to go in and slaughter everybody, men, women, and children. We have a word for this, people. It's called genocide. And if this God were to show up today, he would be brought before the International Criminal Court, unless he was an American, and Americans are exceptional, so they don't participate in that. But, God commands genocide. And a lot of us were taught that's okay. If God does it, it's okay. But somebody showed me something some years ago. When I was talking about a story in the book of Matthew. I just want to give you a little setting here. Matthew chapter 14. It's a feeding of the 5,000. And how many baskets are left over in the feeding of the 5,000? 12. And everybody agrees. This represents a new beginning for the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus is like Moses who gives bread to the people. And just like it was a new beginning when the people came, the 12 tribes who went into slavery now come out of slavery, well, now this represents a new beginning, a new identity for the people. And by the way, in there, Jesus walks on water, probably evoking the crossing of the Red Sea. And in there's a big argument about what's clean and what's unclean. In fact, if you ever wanted to convict Jesus of downright heresy, there was your chance, because he says it really doesn't matter what goes into a person. The law of Moses says it really does matter what goes into a person, and Jesus says it really doesn't. And then Jesus is in so much trouble with the Pharisees and scribes that one of only 2 times he leaves Jewish territory and goes far into Gentile territory for a little beach vacation near Tyre and Sidon. And there he has an encounter with a woman who in Luke's and Mark's gospel is called a Syrophoenician or Sidonian woman, but in Matthew's gospel is called a Canaanite woman. And it's very strange that she's called a Canaanite, because in Jesus' day there were no Canaanites. That would be like calling some of you Vikings. Your ancestors were Vikings, but that's just not a term we use anymore. It's odd that Matthew would talk about. And what does Jesus do? I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And then there's a whole business about I can't give what's holy to the dogs, and and we preachers try to make that sound good. The Greek word is little puppies. And then she says, yeah, but even they get the crumbs. And Jesus says, I have never seen, you have great faith, woman. I haven't seen faith like this. Your daughter's healed. She's healed. Then Jesus goes from there, up by the Mediterranean Sea, comes down toward the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, still in Gentile territory as far as Matthew's concerned. In fact, he makes it clear because Jesus starts teaching crowds and heals them, and it says, they praise the God of Israel. So the same miracle that Jesus did for 5,000 Jews in Matthew's gospel, now he does for 4,000 Gentiles. And guess how many baskets are left over? 7. Now, if you go back to Deuteronomy, when the Lord your God brings you to the land you're entering to possess, drives out before you many nations, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, stalactites, stalagmites, and so on. 7 nations, and they came to be known as the 7 Canaanite nations. Brothers and sisters, I can't help but think that what Matthew is doing here is he's bringing together dueling stories. And he was saying, listen, we used to live by the story that we slaughter Canaanites, but now with Jesus, we live by the story that we heal and feed and care for Canaanites. And we constitute a new identity for us, 12 baskets, a new identity for them, 7 baskets. And this presents Jesus to us as a new Abraham, reconstituting the calling to be a blessing to all nations. A new Moses, leading people to a new freedom and feeding them with a new bread. A new Joshua, not sent into the world to destroy anybody, but sent into the world to save. And we could also look at the way Jesus himself handled stories. You know, in Luke chapter 4, when he preaches the good news, he brings up Isaiah, quotes Isaiah. We often preach that, good news to the poor. We don't pay attention to what happened after he sat down. Everyone speaks well of him. Hey, this is our hometown boy. And then he kind of pushes off that a little bit. And then he reminds them of the story of Elijah, who cared for a widow of Zarephath in Sidon, a Sidonian or Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman. And Elisha, who could have helped a whole lot of lepers in Israel, but helped a Syrian, an outsider. Do you start to see how these stories are interacting with each other? And fascinating things are going on. And by the way, when the people heard Jesus tell these stories, they wanted to kill him, because he was upsetting their dominant story that put them in one place and presented God as one kind of God. Now Jesus is toying and poking holes in that and saying, no, there's another vision. Well, all of that's to say, I hope that stimulates your thinking that the Bible creates this multi-story space in which stories are told in conversation, even in argument. Jesus enters into that space and transforms it, and in so doing, I think, presents us with a radically fresh and new and wonderful and inspiring vision of God that makes me want to sing the kinds of songs we were singing with Mark a little while ago. Praise be to God. Amen. Thanks very much.